Lewis, the Zone 11 director, or Zone 10 director. She will be answering questions. So will Miss Monty Franskowiak, the state vice president, and Tasha, and I forgot her last name, but Tasha will be answering questions. So for those of you just aren't joining us, this is in the webinar form, so your cameras won't be on and your mic will be muted. We will have question and answer, not the chat. The chat won't be working, but you can use the question and answer to ask any questions you want. Kyana will be stopping occasionally to answer questions for you if there's some that we don't have the answers for. And again, we will be recording this.
Greetings, hello. I'm excited to be with you all today. I just want to start today with grounding us in the fact that we are on Coast Salish land and that this land, it had been occupied long before we got here. I also want to note that when we do this work, we definitely bring in history, but also current context. And the fact that we are in COVID right now has really impacted all of our lives. And while it's impacted our lives in many ways, both traumatic and challenging, it has also allowed us to see how interrelated and how closely we're connected. So I just want to say thank you for having me. I think I actually jumped in early.
Okay, our Zone 2 director out of the Spokane area, she works in Deer Park and lives in Spokane, is Susan Olson, and she has a beautiful introduction for Kyana today. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Charlotte. Good evening, everyone. Like Charlotte said, my name is Susan Olson, and I'm a special education paraeducator in the PSE Deer Park Para Chapter, and I'm currently serving as your Zone 2 director. And I want to start by saying, as a person of Native American ancestry, I appreciate Kyana recognizing our Native American heritage and lands here in Washington State. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight, we will be discussing diversity and inclusion and how we can work towards racial equality in both our schools and our union. Our special guest speaker this evening has extensive experience in anti-racism change efforts. She is an accomplished race relations trainer skilled in group facilitation, anti-racist leadership development, and policy impact analysis. Kyana is practiced in implementing systemic change within large, complex structures. She has actively engaged in moving the city of Seattle's race and social justice initiative forward over the past 14 years. She works with organizations to embed institutional practices that create sustainable change and develop infrastructure that supports conversations about systems of oppression through the lens of race. She is experienced in coaching and motivating people to build skill and create capacity in increasing their effectiveness in challenging racial inequality within their organizations. Please join me in giving a warm PSE welcome to Kyana Wheeler.
Thank you. This is the point where I jump in. I appreciate it, Susan. Thank you. And I just want to say to note that one of the reasons why it's so important that we name that we are currently on occupied land is because inequity and oppression are linked together. We all are in this conversation. We all are a part of this conversation. And racism exploits all of us just differently. And so it's very important that we name that even in the current context of COVID. One of the things that is really important is that we identify that we're so interconnected that isolation is the answer, right? We didn't realize until now that how connected we are is the fact that the person who has the least access to healthcare or to being healthy is connected to each of us. even if we think that that is so far away from us. So much that isolation is how we make it through this. And so I want to note that it's so important this moment in time to recognize how intertwined and interconnected our lives are. Part of what racism also does is it robs us of our humanity. It actually asks us to disconnect ourselves from humanity so much that that allows us to see harm and trauma to another individual and say that that's not our problem. It's important that we recognize that humanity is the purpose, the point that we're trying to get to. That's what creates equity and belonging. So I'm going to talk at you for a bit, and then I'm going to interrupt the moment and allow space for questions. But right now I want to share, I'm going to use a PowerPoint to share some of my information. And so I'm going to share my screen with you all and get right to it. And so I was feeling like this is sort of a conversation, and the coffee cup resonated with me because in an hour, we're not going to solve anything. In an hour, you're going to have more questions than answers, and that means I did my job. The more you ask of your own social awareness, the more you will understand. And I'm sorry, for the crew, I'm seeing hands raised. Should I be taking those hands? Does anyone want to?
No, they're to put their things in the chat box, please, Kyana. Thank you.
Okay.
We would like you to continue with your presentation. You did such
Thank you.
a job.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this group. You all are so human. So much so I could stop my recorded presentation to ask that. So thank you. So the coffee cup, I was just saying, resonated with me, really because this is like us having a conversation. And we're going to get into a couple of things. I have some goals for us for this hour, but I really just want to start with letting you know just a little bit about me. So lots of folks, you know, you've probably heard in the intro my background. Lots of folks want to know my background. I have a BA in Ethnic Studies with a Master's in Ed in Organizational Development and a Master's in Public Policy. That's really not, though, what lets me do this work. How I really am able to do the work that I do, and we are not our jobs, right? When somebody says, so tell me about yourself, we usually start with our jobs, right? And so I'm not my education. My lived experience as a Black person and a female allows me to understand how the systems have socialized us and the impacts that cause. And so really my lived experience is the most important part to whenever I tell somebody about myself, and that includes that I'm a mother, that I'm a wife, that I do a lot of community work in addition to my business, and that I'm a spoken word artist. That's the part that allows me to work through the challenges of conversations such as these. I also have 20 years of anti-oppression and anti-racism work, and we'll talk a little bit about how those anti-oppression and anti-racism work connects. But just letting you know that it's a little bit about me and what you can expect. Goals for today, I really want to share with you the impacts of our socialization. And this is a place where a lot of folks can really get into the conversation and understand what that means for them. The second goal is I just want to give you one tool. There's many, many tools for discussing race, but I'm going to give you one tool that is helpful when you have conversations about race. And then the last thing I want to share with you all is the impact of multiple oppressions and how that holds racism together. So when we talk about things such as sexism or ableism or elitism or classism, those frames continue to hold racism together. And I want to just share that with you so that you understand a bit about intersectionality. There's some foundational truths that we have to start with when we have this conversation. These are basics. If these foundational truths are if they don't resonate with you, or if they are uncomfortable with you, or you don't believe them, then we actually aren't having the same conversation. And so I'm outlining these truths for you today so that you know the direction in which I'm coming from, so that that's the conversation we're having. We're actually not asking, does racism exist? We're setting some foundations around how it exists and what that means to us. So the first foundation or truth is that we live in a highly racialized society. And what that means is that race matters. You can see this in all of our data about life outcomes, about racial advantage and disadvantage in your socioeconomic status, in your health access, your life expectancy, in education, criminal justice, and many other institutions. But the baseline that we start with is that race does matter. It is a conversation that we need to have. It is something we need to understand. The second truth is that we're all a part of this picture. It is not possible to live in this society and not experience the impacts of structural racism, whether that's unearned advantage or disadvantage, and how that shows up in our lives. The third truth is that none of us asked for this. None of us are responsible for the past, but all of us are responsible for the present and to some extent the future. This is one of my most important pieces. I often ask when I do trainings or when I'm having discussions or facilitated conversations, I often ask folks, if you had to imagine the society in which we lived, that your children lived in, that the people that you care about and love lived in, would this be it? And I've never had anyone in my 20 years of doing this work say, you know what, exactly like this. This is what I would say that we should have. And because of that, it's the point I want to point to is that we're not responsible for what we were handed. We were handed something that was already fully set up and fully fleshed out to practice racism. But our responsibility here today is that we can either hand that off to our next generation, or we can work through understanding, challenging, and dismantling some of the harm that has come our way. The fourth truth is that we know when we talk about race and racism, we also need to talk about whiteness. The construction of whiteness, how a preference for white was created, and how it functions. And we're not talking about white as in the people, we're talking about whiteness as in a concept of what has been normalized for us in this society. And a lot of folks think that race enters the room when people of color enter the room, and that's just not true. Whiteness has a lot of currency, and if you don't want it, hand it over, because a lot of folks don't have the same currency that whiteness provides. The fifth truth is that we work and play and live in institutions where racism is embedded and manifest in a multitude of small and large ways. And it's our responsibility to seek to understand, challenge, and dismantle it. So those are just the basics that we're going to move from today, is that all of these things are true and that all of these are part of the conversation. And I really want to start off with asking, how do we know what is right and wrong? I'm going to let that question sit for just a few seconds, and I want you to think about, how did you know? How did you come to know what is right and wrong? Who taught you? And who helped you make sense of it? Just sit with that for a moment. And really what we've come to understand is right and wrong happens through our socialization. Socialization is the way that cultures pass down their traditions, their practices, and their systems. This was passed down to us. And the moment we arrived in this world, it was passed down in a multitude of ways, through our family, through language, through food. It gave us understandings of how we are to be in this world. It helped us understand what our role is and how to play our role. It helped us understand things about ourselves. It built our value system. And when we understand all the ways that has socialized us, and this is just some of the ways that we've been socialized. But when we begin to understand our socialization, who helped us make sense of this world, who helped us understand what is right and wrong, then we can begin to unpack where racism actually started in our own awareness. This is a really serious place to stay. Often when I do trainings, I can stay right here for an entire day and talk through the ways that our neighborhoods shaped our understanding, that the house that we grew up in, that the place that we worshiped in, whether we had citizenship or not, what policing means to our neighborhood, about our race and our gender, about partners and what that means in families. We learned a lot by the time that we were 3 years old. The research shows that by the time children are 3 and 4 years old, they know the racial hierarchy of this country. They know what race they do want to be, and they know what race they don't want to be. And they can clearly articulate that. And it's not because somebody sat them down and said, hey, this is exactly how this functions in society. It is because they are absorbing all of the cues for how they are to behave. I usually joke about going to the grocery store. And you know, at the grocery store, you are not supposed to stand right up against the person in line in front of you at checkout. There's just protocol. But no one actually sat you down and told you that. You just paid attention. And so it's important to understand that our socialization is what starts all of this for us. It is what we understand. It is how we come to understand race. And I just want to spend a little bit of time unpacking that and how that functions. I love this quote. Oh, and I didn't put her name. Wairara Rashid. Wairara Rahid. I'm sorry. I will get the name and say it correctly. And I love this piece. She wrote a book called Salt. She wrote a book called Salt and had a challenging time getting that published. And part of the reason is because when they read all of her pieces, the punctuations are different. It doesn't follow English standards. Capitalization is different. The way she frames all of her information was different than what we've been trained for it to be and to function. And so what that looks like then is that she had a challenging time getting her beautiful thoughts and ideas published. So I really just love this quote. And I apologize. Some people, when they hear your story, contract. Others, upon hearing your story, expand. And this is how you know. And it's just really important to note that your way, how you've been socialized, how you grew up, is going to resonate with some folks, and others, it's not. And how that person responds, whether they contract or whether they expand, and whether they allow you to expand, is how we know. How we know what? That's the part that she left. That's for each of us. So take a moment and just think. I'm going to give you just a few moments to think about what ways you were socialized, what institutions solidified this socialization, and what systems enforced it. Because really what socialization did for us is it determined whether we got supported in the way that we feel or the way that we experience the world, or whether we get punished. And so those clear success and punishments helped us identify how we were to show up in this world. That happened through our institutions, and I'm just reading the Bobby Harrow picture. Some through our institutions, through our families. Let me actually start with in the beginning. So we're born into this world and we actually have no place, no blame, no consciousness, no guilt, no choice, limited information. And the moment we begin to cry out in need of help is how we learn that folks will come running. And so we were taught by our family, our friends, relatives, people who we love and trust. And that is our first socialization. And that is why it's so important to understand that going through your own awareness, your own socialization, unpacking that for yourself is important, because a lot of this we took at face value because of people we love and trust. That also happened with institutions such as our churches and our schools, the legal system. It also happened through enforcements. whether we were rewarded or punished or privileged for the places in which we grew. And so just sharing this as an example of all of the ways in which this functioned, all of those things that came up on our socialization, how it functioned within systems. And this actually functions to build our biases. I questioned if I should throw in, because implicit bias is an entire chunk of digging on its own. But I think it's important that we understand that our socialization is actually what builds our implicit bias. So just a little bit on how your biases function. The human brain, this is the science of it, the human brain takes in 11 million pieces of information in any one moment. Any given moment. It takes in 11 million bits of information about how you're feeling with the temperature in the room, about what you're hearing in the background. But your focus is on me and on the information I'm sharing and on the facial expressions I'm making or the inflection in my voice. You're not paying attention to those few things that, that your brain is taking in and just processing and making sense of. Because if we took in all of that information in any given moment, we wouldn't be able to function. Our brain is literally looking for patterns, and it's connecting those patterns and the information we're taking in to things that are common. And so this is how our socialization gets into our biases. We're taking in all of this information. We're not actually questioning most of it because we're only conscious of maybe 40 at best, 40 of these pieces. Not 40%, 40 out of 11 million pieces of information. And so we're already set up not to know or see our biases. We're already set up through our socialization not to understand how that's functioned to continue the way that our systems function. And even inside of these 40 bits of information, we're only aware of 2% emotionally. We're only aware of 2% of what's going on emotionally for us. And so that's where our bias resides. It resides in our unconscious. It resides in those 11 million pieces of information that we're not even aware of. Our bias is building and connecting and patterning and putting into common, sorry, I lost my words. It puts it into common understanding that we already have, that we've gotten when we were very, very young. And those messages are framed to speak. All of the information we get are framed to speak to our unconscious. So that's kind of how our biases show up. And it lets us know that our thoughts are not colorblind. The way that this works is that symbols, symbolic racism, the use of images, code words, and metaphors that implicitly signal race, those are things like the word urban, the word terrorist, the word thug. Those symbols of race are clearly connected to patterns our brain has already put together, that those are brown and black folks. All those words I used are black and brown folks. And our brain will pick that up. It will trigger the unconscious racism that is embedded inside of us from our socialization. And it will come out through our thoughts and our actions. Our unconscious bias is developed literally through the networks that we're not even thinking about. All of the things that are associated to race, even when we're not saying it. So when people are like, is it about race? It's always about race, and it's about other things. Before I offer this next tool, this tool will help us really be able to frame conversations of racism. I want to just stop sharing right here and just offer the moment up to any questions so far.
Yes, we have a question from Charlene Nyholm. She wants to know, what is whiteism?
Whiteism?
Correct, whiteism.
That's something I would have to look up. I've never heard of whiteism. Generally, when we talk about anti-racism, we talk about whiteness as a practice that has been developed and embedded into our systems way, way back. And an example of like whiteness would be the way that we take the outcome of colonization right now. We are the outcome of colonization. We are the expected outcome of genocide, of indigenous folks. Like, this was the outcome. The fact that we don't question that is part of whiteness. The fact that this is normalized is part of whiteness. And whiteness is a frame to understand what we consider normal in this country. And we'll go into that a little deeper too. Any other questions to ask?
This is Charlotte. I saw in the question box, they wondered if they would be able to get the slides that you're doing.
Absolutely. I can send these on.
Bless you. Thank you.
I'll send them right afterwards.
Looks like we have another question from Erica Collier. How do you go about filing for a grievance when you've been harassed on your job? That might be one for staff.
Sorry, I muted myself. I agree. That's definitely one for staff. You know, there's a lot of policies and practices that are in place exactly for these reasons. And one of the things that I would note is that, and we'll talk next about the way in which you can hold a conversation around oppression or around racism or around harm, that will help give you some language. And we'll go into that next. And actually, let's go into that if there's no other questions. Go ahead and share my screen again. And so this is the first chunk of information. I just wanted to lay out for you a bit about how socialization functions to help racism continue in our practices and in our conversations and in our unconscious. And the next piece I want to share with you will help give you some tools around ways that you can have this conversation. This information is everything that has been gathered since the civil rights. This conversation that we have at the national level around anti-racism is everything that's been learned from the civil rights, in addition to intersecting other isms that continue to oppress and harm folks. And when you think about these 4 levels, and I'm going to go through them, but when you think about these 4 levels, this gives you clarity on where things are held, and this will make much more sense in just a moment, but it gives you clarity at where the issues are. And it also lets you know that the solutions are different at each of these levels. And I want to use that grievance example maybe to walk through some of these. That might be a helpful example. But really stating that the 4 levels of oppression are interpersonal. They happen between each of us. They're institutional. They happen through policy, through practice, through unspoken norms. They are internalized, meaning that the messages that we hold about self and others function within these practices of interpersonal and institutional. And then structural would be the entire society and how it holds all of this together. Structural is how multiple institutions work together to collude for this to continue. So the 4 levels of oppression, they work together. One of them is not happening without the other. but separating them helps us understand. They also reinforce each other. Our internalized values and biases come out interpersonally. Institutions are also made up of people, so they're upheld through institutions. And then again, we're teaching young folks that are in our lives, and so we reinforce systems even when we don't believe in that practice. And it's built on our socialization and our societal norms. And so just to go over the 4 levels and understand exactly what we're talking about, and side note, you can use these 4 levels for any ism. If we're talking about sexism, classism, ableism, but racism is what created these tools. Racism didn't create these tools. Anti-racist educators created these tools. If we're talking about the 4 levels of oppression, I'm going to use symbols to really get down to the clarity of what we're talking about. I'm using the circle to talk about the entire thing, the structure, the thing that holds it together. I like the circle because it is never ending. You can't actually find a point where it starts there and the point where it ends here. The circle is continuous and it feeds itself. And so it's a really good reminder for how society and systems function. This is the structural level of racism. There's then the institutional level, and I'm using a triangle to reference hierarchy. In our institutions and pretty much in our society, there's very few people at the top determining the rules and the agenda and the resources and the goals, and a lot of folks at the bottom carrying that out. And that's why a triangle is often used for hierarchy. It reflects an org chart. The interpersonal is about people, and the interpersonal is what holds an institution together. The people make up the institution, but the people can also change the institution. And so interpersonal level is about people. And then this is a brain or your thought. The thought bubble represents internalized. We all get the same messages. Depending on how we're situated within society is whether those messages are positive or negative. And so we all get the same messages. And I want to go through a little bit deeper so that we understand what we're looking at and talking about, because this is really going to help you have a conversation about racism and understand at what level it's happening, because what most people think racism functions as is in that interpersonal space. But these are all very connected and tied together. So I want to start with internalized. And so this would be in your brain. These are your thought patterns. And we talked a bit about socialization at the beginning. That socialization really defines our self-awareness, our awareness of others, our biases, our beliefs, our values, the perceptions that we have, the lens in which we look through the world, as well as our self-worth and the messages that we take in are regularly coded in this way. Internalized values, our values are based on beliefs about self and others, perceptions of self and communities. Inference is drawn about self. So when I was telling you, like, folks don't actually sit you down and tell you that this is the racial hierarchy of this country, but we definitely draw inference regarding what we've experienced when we engage with others as well as institutions. And if we have limited information and interactions with difference, then that builds our biases. Our socialization is clearly identified. There's a norm, and then there's everyone else. And so limited access to everyone else is going to build our biases. We have biases. We can't get away from that. And the way that we were pulled into this world through understanding how we are to behave and the roles that we are to play, let us know what is normal. Interpersonal, those beliefs and values and norms, often called preferences, tied to our histories and our traumas and our behaviors, those biases, they're in our thoughts. Once they come out of our mouth, though, we have thoughts, I often ask folks, have you ever been talking to somebody who's clearly different from you, whether that is in ability or in citizenship status or age? You're talking to somebody clearly different from you, and you are watching the words that are coming out of your mouth. That is your clearest moment of awareness about how your socialization has created biases for you, and you don't want to make sure those come through your mouth and harm somebody. So you're watching all the words that come out of your mouth. That's exactly what interpersonal racism, that's how that functions. Same with the other person you're connected to, and our internalized thoughts, those become our words and our actions. And once they become our words and our actions, that's interpersonal racism. And when folks are asking, well, was that racist or were they being racist? What they're actually asking about is this moment, this place. They're not asking about the thoughts that that person grew up with or the ways in which they were trained to be in this world. They're talking about, what did you say to the other person? But really, racism lives even deeper than that. It lives in our institutions, through our policies, our practices, what is normal for our org, patterns, support, discipline. Shows up in our schools, work, play, worship, neighborhood, community. Shows up in all of these places, and everything that is working to hold that together, all of those practices or patterns or policies, shape institutional racism. And this is the place that most folks don't come to when they are thinking about how is racism playing out. When you have the authority to define the reality for somebody else, that is how institutions function. They help define how people will and will not be. They help to give support for acting one way and discipline or punishment to make sure you don't continue acting a certain way. That's where institutional racism happens. And when we're talking about that question of grievance, there's a lot that should be unpacked in what were the internalized or emotional impacts, what were the interpersonal practices or issues that happened, how is the institution upholding that? Are they afraid to say something? Are they willing to just fire somebody rather than having conversations about how they could change? Those are all institutional things. And that institution is really clearly standing upon the impact of structural racism that all of us are experiencing. The structural racism that has asked us to disregard humanity. I like to give the example of, there was this orca whale that was in our Puget Sound. And many of you might remember they lost the baby, the orca whale, the baby died. And that orca whale carried around that baby for, gosh, like a week, 10 days, something that was just painful. And at the exact same time, the US was putting kids in cages at the border for crossing a line that has been put in place by laws and the larger society of US bordering, right, has changed over so many decades. But by crossing this imaginary border, kids were put in cages and nobody could connect. When I was having those conversations at that time, nobody could connect the loss of the life for that orca whale and what its mother was going through with the harm that was happening to human children and what those families were going to. And that's how racism harms our humanity, by allowing things to happen that we know are traumatic, but saying that, well, they didn't, they did something wrong, or they, you know, I was going to say crossed a law, but they went against a law or a public regulation. And then that enforcement was something painful and traumatic that human beings carry with them in their cells and pass down to generations, right? And so it's important that we understand how this is held together, and that when we are talking about dominant cultural norms, that's where the conversation of whiteness comes from, because that was the first dominant cultural norm to be framed in our society. It was framed from the moment of arrival of the colonizers. And those dominant cultural norms are dominant values, the things that we value. Currently, the conversations around the Black Lives Matter hashtags has been about, do we value humans or do we value property that's insured, right? Like, we're not actually questioning those things, because what is normal is that you don't have an uprising we don't have social unrest, right? Single narratives is also how the system holds us together. There's one right way of being, doing, and thinking, even though we are many, many, many different people. So having a single narrative will uphold racism as a society, as well as our expectations and regulations in our public practices. As well as unspoken rules when we don't actually dig deep and peel back the layers of what is unspoken. That is how oppression continues. And so again, I thought I had one more. You know, I always hate when people go back through the PowerPoint, but I'm going to do it. I thought I had one more slide that went back to this whole picture of how connected oppression is, how connected racism is to the entire society, the institutions we are in, the people we are connected to, and ourselves included, as well as the ways that we think about people in this world from what our socialization has told us is right and wrong. I'm going to stop there and just offer an opportunity for questions again.
Yes, we have one from Gina Wright Smith. She asks, how does one deal with rejecting whiteness once they realize how ingrained it is in their lives, like dealing with those you know influenced prior racism?
Yeah, that question is the money question, right? How do we actually disengage from this thing that has benefited us? I'm going to use myself as an example. I have benefited from racism in ways such as elitism. And that means that I bought into that education is the way that you succeed in this world. I bought into that I have to have multiple degrees or I wasn't valuable or worthy. I bought into that this is what defines our knowledge base. And it took me a long time of working through my own stuff to let go of the fact that I've been taught that if I can get so much education, I will no longer be a Black woman in this world. And it took harm and trauma and pain for me to recognize that that actually isn't true. And for me to uphold this concept of white normativity around education being just the thing that everybody needs and then racism will go away, my buying into that continue to hold racism in place even while I'm trying to do anti-racism work. And it was somebody who told me, you know, thanks so much for sharing your degrees at the beginning, but that actually isn't why this works. You can't get the theory and then believe that that's done. Like, our personal practices and our untying of our values and norms to white dominant culture, that's really what we're tied to. Our value system, what is normal for us, what benefits us, is tied to a white system. And when we recognize that a single narrative, a monocultural view, even a single language makes us actually not fit to support change, is when we start engaging in different socializations, we start putting different information into us. And I don't think that we will ever rid ourselves from that bias. We will have to do constant work to remind ourselves, oh yeah, that actually upholds this thing. I also want to add, please join any of the white anti-racist organizations that are available. There's CARW, can't remember what it stands for, but CARW, and SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice. We use acronyms so much that I just get comfortable with the acronyms. But there are places in which they'll ask you the deep questions about disengaging. They'll ask you to challenge your socialization. And sometimes that means challenging, people in our lives we love about that frame of reference. But the more you speak about it, the more you find words for it, the more you try it on for yourself, the more ability you have to actually have the conversations or even question that single narrative.
Yes, ma'am. We have several more questions.
Oh, wow.
The next one is from Leslie Whitman. She says, can you explain why the unconscious mind is colorblind?
It's not colorblind. It is absolutely bound to symbols that bring up faces. When we were talking about I'm going to go back to that slide real quick. And I hope it's quite possible that when I was talking about it, that I just skipped a word and said that it is colorblind. My apologies, it's not colorblind, not at all. And I just want to go back to this one. So they're not colorblind. The symbols in our society, for instance, when we say wealthy, there is an image that comes in our head, and it's usually white and male and able-bodied and educated. And it's citizen and speaks English and is heterosexual. Like there's pictures that come to our mind that are just symbolic coded words. When we use boy next door, I promise you it doesn't look like my 6'4" black son with a big afro, right? So there's images that are coded into our patterns of awareness and socialization. When we say things like welfare queen, none of that says race. And we know by the data that there's more white folks who are on welfare than there are for folks of color. And we also know that welfare has been used, people use it as a place that they are in that moment, and then they go on. There's actually lots of research shows that people aren't scamming the system, which is what a lot of people, the single narrative that a lot of folks get. So when we say the word welfare queen, it brings up a black woman with multiple children who's scamming the system. This came from the conversations that were had politically during Reagan's time, where we must get rid of those folks who were scamming the system. And so those symbols, while they don't say race at all, right? Those symbols are clearly tied to the patterns in our head that the media has shown, that schools have shown, things of that nature, that bring forth those images. So thank you for naming, if I missed that one word, they are not colorblind.
Thank you. We also have a question from Alicia. She asks, if we have no responsibility for the racial inequalities in the past, how does that reflect on the current state of restitution in the US, the white guilt, versus changing the conversation to affect the future generations to avoid repeating mistakes?
So one of the places in which we have conversations in anti-racism is an and place, both and part of that helps us not have a single narrative. And so when we take those and we juxtapose those next to each other, we're saying one or the other, and they're actually very, very tied. While it's not the society that we created, our ancestors created it, right? And so how do we separate generations before from generations that are coming? We would never say that when we're talking about wealth. And we would never say that when we're talking about wealth building, because one of the ways, like right now, I think these statistics are like the last census out of date. So I apologize, that would make them 10 years out of date. But it was that Black families have 1/8 the wealth of white families just in general. And we're not talking about income, we're talking about wealth. When you are able to add all the things you own and separate what your debts are, and you have left over, that's wealth, right? That's the dollar amount, that's your net value, your net wealth. And so folks who were Black and brown were left out of the only wealth building opportunities for general normal society for a number of generations when the GI Bill was passed and veterans could go get homes. This is the first time in our entire history where homes were available to the common person. This was 1930s, right? Homes were available for the very first time when the FDIC, when the federal government said that they would underwrite mortgages, right? These are public funds. Black and brown and white folks, public funds went to underwriting white suburbia. And so we can't let go of the fact that it was 34 years before they actually took that, put in a different policy with the Housing Act. And then it was another 15 years, we're in the 80s now, talking about 1980s, where they said, I was serious. I said, stop doing that, right? And so when they actually put in enforcements for that. And so there's generations that built wealth that was actually left out for folks of color. And so when we say, what does it mean for the next generation? We have to connect that to what is it meant for the other generations. Every conversation about racism is a both and.
Okay, so Melissa Espinosa has a question, and she says, as a person of color, what support can a person get from either their union or other organizations when they find themselves receiving bias and continued racism from a culture/school district that doesn't even see their own biases, especially in a rural community or district, predominantly white male? How do you not give up or lose faith? How can one advocate for themselves, their coworkers, and their students?
I just want to do my poetry snap for that question, and the way that it's tied to so many other things. When you were talking about even geography, such as rural versus urban, right? There's so many pieces in that, and they all connect to race. And I think that's definitely a question for, PSE to take on and think through. I think that when PSE does that they should talk about where their values are tied. But as a person, and I should say as a Black woman in this world, speaking directly about race, and having people be challenged by that or have things to say about me because of that, I'm constantly reminding myself. A friend of mine told me, and I'm constantly reminding myself, I deserve joy. My birthright is joy. All of our human birthright is joy. And to invest in the things for myself that bring that joy is how I make it through. But there's a lot of work there's a lot of healing efforts that are in like self-help books and things like that around being a person of color, experiencing messages that are painful and traumatic, becoming an adult where you speak your truth, and then having that challenge because a single narrative or a monocultural view is what is valued and held in this society. I just wanted to say that question was right on point, and there's no answer. But your birthright is joy. Do what you can to sit in your birthright.
Our next question comes from John Capel. I think I understand how racism permeates so many aspects of our lives, but if our DNA is 99.99% the same, does race exist? Was it invented?
Thank you. Thank you so much. That is like a foundational question that we still grapple with today, even though research has named that there's no way that you can actually take the blood of somebody and find the DNA for race. It just doesn't exist. And that means that race is socially constructed. That means that there were parameters put around race to create a separation and a difference way back when it was economical. It was owning property, owning people as property, and it was about wealth building. And so just to be clear, it is socially constructed. It's still very real. There's other things that are socially constructed in this world, like money. It's a social construct. There's actually no value in this cotton dollar, but we put value on it. And money and wealth is socially, not wealth, I'm sorry, but money is socially constructed, but we still value it very much. And so just saying that, yeah, it is socially constructed, it's still very real in our life experiences. And I just want to say I'm getting a note to move on due to time. I know that there is this a moment that I need to pass it to Travis? Or can I share a little bit more? You tell me. Go for it. Okay. I'm just going to share one last slide so that we know how other ways in our lives, like nobody gets to get out of this conversation of racism. We all have been socialized to buy into the system that we currently have. And I am just going to show this. Sorry, my mouse is moving slow. And I apologize. I just got to go through here where we've already been because I went backwards. Thank you all for letting me talk at you too. And it's right after here. So people often ask me, and I just want to share this, how this works. People often ask me, why are we always talking about black and white? Why are these the conversation? And I want to say that it's not. I want to tell you all that is not the conversation, is the both and. Again, the conversation was set up in our society way, way back before, you know, multiple generations before us. It was set up around black and white. And what they've asked, what the system has asked, is that those who are set up in this system to desire whiteness, to desire what whiteness offers, to desire the currency that it offers. So when that functions, this is kind of what it looks like. This isn't kind of, this is what it looks like. And you will even see this if you look at all of the data around race, that setting up this bookend of black and white has erased indigenous folks completely from this picture. And that's part of colonization. There's no way that colonizing folks, genocide and trauma and harm can happen if you continue to center them. And so the first thing that happened was they were ignored completely out of this conversation of race. And I'm putting all of these in here because we have to be thinking about all of these things, right? So oftentimes you'll look up our data, and our data around you know, health disparities or economic gaps or whatever often won't include data of Native Americans. And if you are looking at your data, always ask why. And it's usually around our value system, around what we consider enough, numerically enough. Now, the Asian, Pacific Islander, and Latino or Hispanic, I think is what you will see, are part of our census. Like these are the categories that they're asking you to name. And so what they're asking is, and if you even look at the way that things are set up, white is on top for the census. It asks, are you white first? And then it goes into the rest of things. This is around our value system. And so these are, I'm putting these in here because these come from our census, but I'm also adding in a couple other that we don't often talk about. I added Middle Eastern specifically here because in the census, it says that Middle Eastern folks are considered white. And I know a lot of Black and brown Middle Eastern folks who are like, that is not my lived experience. So I also added Middle Eastern. I added multi-ethnic because we don't often talk about multi-ethnic or mixed with white or multiracial folks and how that functions in this bookend. And so just naming that, what it asks, what this white-black dynamic asks is that you get as far away from anything Black and as close to everything white. It's called proximity to whiteness. And that functions by individuals attempting to gain proximity to whiteness through leveraging all the other oppressions, through leveraging our colonialism, by not talking about how we even got to the place that we are and that it's the outcome of colonization. Getting as far away from Black and anything Black has to do with our anti-Blackness. Most folks who talk about they're mixed, myself, I'm mixed. My father is white by race, Italian by ethnicity. My mother is Black. And I, all through my life, was like, I'm mixed as a way to be different from Black folks. But now I say I'm Black because I've never gotten any of that 50% white currency that I am. People use gender in our patriarchal society. People use class to be better than somebody. So every time that we're using any one of these other oppressions, we're stepping on the neck of somebody below us just to make this system stay in place, right? What if we had ideas that the gender expansive or non-binary ideas, if they were encompassed in our value system, we wouldn't stand on folks to get closer to what is currency in this society. So people use class, education, citizenship, sexual orientation, language. When folks immigrate here and they're like, what is this mess that I'm now part of? One of the first things they do is assimilate, because assimilation breeds connectivity. And rather than saying, I can be completely in my whole self and be in this system, because the system has taught us you can't be your whole self. You must be a certain way. There is right and wrong way to be and to live and to think. Folks use ability in the same way, whether it is whether it's cognitive or whether it is physical, and folks use religion in the same way. And these things are used to say that some people are valuable and others are not, or that I'm more valuable in this area, but don't look at this part of my identity. And people use that, and it maintains racism. And I gave you the example of education for myself. I know this is recorded and I'm sharing a lot of personal information, but my brother, I went the education route and he went through the criminal justice system. And I spent a lot of time believing I was somehow better than him because I went this route, rather than understanding me saying I'm better than him continues to uphold and harm and traumatize, and will continue to pass this down to our next generations. I'm gonna stop sharing there. I feel like I just unloaded on y'all, but hopefully a lot of that made sense. So I'm gonna pass it to Travis, and thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you, Kyana. This was very good information, and I'm glad that you're willing to share the slides. There was a question of who wrote the book Salt.
Oh, thank you. Let me get her name. Let me get their name, because I actually don't know how that person identifies. And I will put that in the chat for you while Travis takes it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kyana. Appreciate it. So everyone, thanks so much for joining us this evening. We do have a couple of giveaways that we're going to do now. So you do have to be present to win. So I'm going to share my screen here and show you how we're going to do this. Okay. So we've got a list of all of our attendees tonight. Everybody has been assigned a number. The range goes from 3, let's see here, all the way down to 340. So we've got random.org up. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. And we'll put our number range in there. And we actually have 2 giveaways tonight. The first giveaway, I know everybody's been waiting to hear what that is. It's a pretty awesome prize. We're going to give away a Bose speaker. So the person who wins this first giveaway will be very lucky indeed. And I believe we have opened the chat to all attendees as well. So if you are on with us, if you could go ahead and just let us know in the chat. Otherwise, we are going to pick another potential winner here. So I'm going to go ahead and enter the range here. What it does is it just selects a random number somewhere in that range. So let's go ahead and generate. 197. Okay, lucky number 197. So Juana Juarez. Let me take a look at the chat here, just make sure. Juana Juarez, if you could just go ahead and enter your name in the chat if you're still on with us. Give a second here. Juana, you are on. Fantastic. Congratulations. You are the recipient of our Bose speaker. So we will go ahead and take down your info, and we will get you the information on how you can redeem that prize. Congratulations. For our second prize this evening, we do have a $100 Fred Meyer gift card, good for groceries or gas. So that is a pretty awesome prize in itself as well. So I'm going to go ahead and draw another name here. 324. Let's take a look here. Christy Kinney. Christy, if you're still on the call, if you could go ahead and enter your name in the chat box and let us know you're here. We'll give you a few moments. Again, that's Christy Kinney, Kinney. Christy Kinney, there you are. Perfect. Congratulations. All right, everybody. I think that's it for this evening. If you haven't already gone and registered for the rest of the webinars this week, we've got some great stuff coming up. Tonight was just wonderful. Kyana, thank you again so much for joining us this evening. And we have a lot in store for you for the rest of the week too. So go ahead and check your email. You should have received registration links this afternoon. And we hope to see you for the rest of PSE's Virtual Summer Conference. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.